You are short, she said. He took my what? You took me mic? Yes, you don't need a mic. Yes. Hi, everybody. Hello, Florida. That was a great performance just now, wasn't it? Wasn't it great? Yes. Great. Very good. Very good. I almost wanted to jump on stage myself, but that would be a good idea. In any case, thank you so much for that wonderful and warm welcome, Katie. Thank you. And it's freezing in here. It's supposed to be Florida. I'm okay. I'm sure I'll heat up the room and sign and get my blood working and get Jack working, and we'll all be in a big flop sweat at the end of all this. This is Jack Jason, by the way, my interpreter. Hi. I can hear you. You can talk. In any case, I usually will I've spoken all over the United States, and I've done it for a long time, and I'm much older than you probably are in this room. So, because of technology and whatever is available out there, it's so improved, I'm using an iPad for my remarks. So, because I'm not very good at memorization, usually my lines on Switched at Birth or at work or talking to my kids, because I have to say things over and over again, the same things over and over again. So, lucky you, I get to use my iPad. In any case, recently a news item appeared about a group of British researchers who were able to rebuild the nerves in the ears of gerbils, okay? And they said that the same technique could conceivably be applicable to deaf humans. So, always the loudest person in the room, or anywhere, that's me, I decided that I would think out loud about the implication of this on Twitter. And I wrote this on Twitter. Deafness cure, with the hashtag in front of it. Deafness cure is trending. My concern is that it's bigger than a trend. It involves people. And it's not as simple as the 4 letters in the word cure. See, I knew I would generate a lot of discussion, but I didn't realize that it would generate so much controversy. Because as one Twitter follower commented, you wouldn't deny fixing a hole in your child's heart, Marlee. Why would you deny fixing someone who has lost their hearing? Well, about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to address similar concerns when a reader who was saddened about the loss of his hearing wrote to Ann Landers. He said, deafness cuts you off from things. Deafness cuts you off from people. And if given the choice between being blind or being deaf, he would choose to go blind rather than deaf. Because while blindness cuts you off from things, deafness cuts you off from people. So Anne asked for feedback from her readers, and of course, I had to jump in. Because I said, deafness cuts you off from people only if you let it. I wrote that if that were the case, we wouldn't have successful deaf doctors or lawyers. There's even a deaf Oscar winner, and deaf America. And I continue by saying that no one will ever have to choose between going blind or going deaf. So this imaginary game of choosing accomplishes nothing, except to remind us that the real handicap of deafness does not lie in the ear, it lies in the mind. So, let me clarify my controversial tweet. Never in my wildest dreams would I want somebody not to be cured of a hearing loss, if that's what they wanted. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm about choice. I want people to make informed choices about what to do when faced with a hearing loss. It's what I've told thousands of parents of deaf children who've asked me if they should get their child a cochlear implant. I say, do whatever you feel best. It's my standard reply. But then I always add, make sure you consider all the options. Speech. By the way, I do speak, but I'm not speaking now because it's faster to sign, and besides, that's what I pay Jack for. devices, like the hearing aids that I use now, and these, which I use with American Sign Language. It's what my parents did for me, and look where I am today. Stories about cures. They make great headlines. But at the end of the day, we have to recognize that behind all this talk, there are millions of deaf people who have families, they have productive jobs, productive lives. Some of us sign, some of us speak, and some of us do both. And if you told us we needed to be cured, a lot of us would respond, of what? I am proud of who I am, of the beautiful language and the culture of American Sign Language. And I am proud to be able to speak as well, despite what people view as a quote-unquote handicap. I would ask people to look at our abilities rather than dwell on our perceived disabilities. You know, if you look up my name on Google or on Wikipedia, you might see that I became deaf, as you heard earlier, at 18 months, as a result of a childhood illness called roseola. But that's not true. Even my parents might have gotten it wrong when people asked them, and they said, oh, Marlee became deaf because of a high fever. The truth is that doctors have been unable to pinpoint what caused my deafness. Whatever the cause was, the result was that I lost all my hearing in one ear, and only 20% remained in the other ear, and I wasn't yet even 2 years old. My parents, well, with this news, they were devastated. My mother said to a reporter many years later that when she found out I was deaf, she had no idea what she or my dad would do. Because in my mother's mind, there were no such thing as deaf children. She'd never even seen one. So how then could she or my dad know what to do? My parents grieved, and they felt guilty. And even to this day, my dad still has a difficult time talking about my deafness to anyone who asks him about it. But thankfully, my parents quickly learned that standing strong was the best way to deal with my being deaf in a hearing world, especially when it came to attitudes towards my being deaf. They were determined to let nothing stand in their way. From the beginning, my parents treated me as any child should be treated, with love and respect. Though doctors suggested to my parents that they send me to a school for deaf children hundreds of miles away, after each visit, my parents came back with the same question. Who would put Marlee to bed each night and say, I love you? And it's not that the schools weren't good schools. All of them were great places for learning, but my parents wanted to see me each day after school, and they wanted me to feel included. And when the doctors had no answers, my parents took matters into their own hands, and they decided to keep me at home and send me to schools right in the neighborhood. Each day, my parents opened up the front door of our house in suburban Chicago, and they encouraged me to go out and play. It didn't matter to them that I was deaf. Instead, life was going to be as quote-unquote normal as it could be for me. And you know, I always qualify using the word normal, because who decides what normal really is? Well, eventually, they got what they wanted. My life was so normal that many years later, a reporter described my life as one long episode of The Brady Bunch. And he was right. With that attitude of never taking no for an answer, I was encouraged to dream big and be whomever I wanted to be. So I imagined myself as who? Marcia Brady, with long hair, skating down the street, even though she was deaf, skating down the street, saying hi to everyone, whether they knew me or not. Well, I have to admit here today something, and that even though it empowered me to dream big, not all my dreams turned out that way that I expected. Because although I'm known as an actress, and an author, and a producer, and an advocate for people who face barriers, I'm also a mom of 4. And with being a mom of 4 comes a whole other host of responsibilities. Closet organizer, soccer mom, a very loud soccer mom, cook, dog sitter, Yes, Mom, we promise we'll take care of the dog. Yes, Mom, we promise. Yeah, we really do. Right. And pretend math whiz. Whatever dreams I entertained about being the very beautiful Marcia Brady gave way to a new reality, because now I am Alice, the maid. Goodbye, Marcia, Marcia, Marcia. The oldest ones here in the audience know who they were talking about, right? Those are the ones that are laughing. In any case, back to my story of growing up in Chicago. I really loved the freedom that my parents gave me growing up as a child who happened to be deaf. But there were bumps in the road. Sometimes children in the neighborhood could be cruel and could be bullies. But in my parents' mind, that was all a part of just growing up. And growing up as a Matlin meant you had an answer for everything. When kids made fun of my hearing aids, my dad told me to tell them, no, they're not hearing aids. Tell them they're big globs of bubble gum. You want some? And when kids made fun of the way I talked, my brothers stepped in and offered their own defense by saying, no, their little sister doesn't speak funny. Instead, she has an accent because our parents are foreign, dangerous spies. Next, it always worked every time. But the best answer they had was for me. Because when I told them I didn't like the sign that the city put up in front of our house that said, caution, deaf child crossing, because I thought it would remind people that I was different, they offered a more positive perspective. They told me it was a sign that announced you were coming to my neighborhood. Besides, they told me, what other kid in the neighborhood had their own sign? Yes, it was such an empowering message that I used it as the title of my first novel for children, and I called it Deaf Child Crossing. You know, in addition to encouraging my dreams, my parents gave me every tool they could to get their hands on to make sure that I would fully participate in society. For the first 5 years of my life, I was taught the oral method, which is making sounds to copy the speech of those who could hear. It was tough, and it required a great deal of effort and concentration, but I was persistent. Like Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker, I was eager to learn the name of everything in my world, picking up as much of what my parents and my brothers were saying by reading their lips and attempting to speak to them the way that I saw them speak to each other. It was a lot of work. I was also fitted with hearing aids, though according to my parents, I hated them. Like another scene out of The Miracle Worker, when Helen refused to take her spoon. I was always trying to get rid of my hearing aids, tossing them whenever they bothered me. Once in the heater, once outside of the car. And it resulted in searches through the neighborhood with a reward of candy or $1 to anyone who found my hearing aids. It's true. This tendency to throw tantrums, in retrospect, is not surprising. Many parents of children with disabilities and barriers can tell you a million stories of those kind of tantrums. In my case, being a child who's deaf, they're only able to share what is seen when the rest of the world seems to whiz by, talking, speaking, hearing. That is why frustration comes so easily. No one seems to understand what you're saying, and you feel dismissed and looked over. As an adult, I can look back at the anger, knowing it was triggered by the ways the world that could hear isolated me from a world that I wanted to embrace and absorb with passion. Anyone else in the family could pick up the phone and call my grandmother. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Everyone else understood the dramas and the sitcoms that played on television, but someone had to fill in the blanks for me. With 1,000 questions about life, too many times, no one who was there knew how or would take the time to explain it to me. I was frustrated, and I felt like I was living in a fog. But the fog lifted when I learned to sign at 5 years old. I remember very clearly. My first night with a deaf teacher. My mother was there, learning sign language right along beside me. My world changed overnight. Communication and meaning flowed into my life at full force, and the fog was gone. What was once a world filled with frustration and anger, not being able to understand what was being said. My hands were now my partners in communication. There was a whole community of people out there who spoke the same way I did, speaking, signing, lip reading. It was all there to make my world understood. So many times in my travels throughout the world, I come across classes of deaf children and I ask them, what it is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they look at me with blank stares. And at first I think, oh, it's because we sign different languages. Because many of you here might not know that sign language is not international. Okay? And perhaps I thought, well, they don't understand my signs. But when I ask their teachers to translate for me, I still get the same blank stares. And it's then I realize that the children simply know what they got through the parrot method. I call it the parrot method. The teachers seem to think that if the students only copied what they did, repeating the language, doing it over and over again, eventually they would learn language. But what these children learned was not language. The concepts of expressing how one thought, understood, saw the world were not there. Instead, it was just simple mechanics. Speak well, and the rest will come, their teachers seem to say. But I, and many teachers of the deaf, we know differently. Language is so vital in the development of any child who is deaf. And language is the earth from which the mind of the child grows. One can spend all day teaching a child to say the word love until they say it perfectly, but without the ability to understand what love is. Then the repetition means nothing. What is love? Helen asked Annie Sullivan. And Annie drew her close and pointed to her heart and said, "It is here." And it was then that Helen was conscious of beating heart for the first time. And though she was initially puzzled, the mere touching of it created the process of language. She eventually came to understand what love meant, and so much more. Well, in addition to my parents, I also had teachers and mentors, people who devoted countless hours to my upbringing and education. So many times, I meet parents of recently deafened children, and they ask me, what should I do with my child? Where should I take them to school? And the most important thing I tell them, and which I cannot stress enough, is that a child needs a mentor or a devoted teacher. A child who operates with a language that is different from their peers, or who lives in a world with a different set of senses, needs stability. They need the attention, someone devoting time to them. And a teacher or a mentor is that person. It's critical.